Our final speaker of the day, I'd like to offer a very warm welcome to Professor Crawley, who is the Chair in International Migration at the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University. So please give Heaven a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cassie, and thank you for the invitation to come here today. I'm really speaking, I guess, on behalf of my colleagues at the Centre. My own personal interests and my own experience and, I guess, expertise, but I use that in very much in inverted commas, is around international migration. And that's a theme that has repeatedly emerged during this afternoon's conversation. We've heard about how in the absence of peace, in the presence of conflict, often it's the movement of people that's a very obvious consequence in terms of what happens when you don't have the opportunity for peace. So what I wanted to do really, and I won't take too long about it, is just to say a little bit about the work of the Centre, and I suppose some of our work in this area in particular in relation to migration, and how for us, working in partnership with others at both the local, the national and international levels are really critical to the kind of work that we are engaged with. So for those of you who don't know, the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations is a relatively new centre in the city and a relatively new centre in the university. But of course it builds on a tradition of other centres that have existed here for many years, which have really focused on issues of peace, conflict resolution and issues of trust. So this new centre brings together people from a whole range of different backgrounds. It really reflects and tries to represent the wide range of different interests that come together in different contexts to either contribute towards peace or undermine it. And so it's a very interdisciplinary research centre. It's very much oriented towards influencing and informing policy and not simply looking at these issues from an academic viewpoint. And one of the things I was asked to do today was to sort of reflect on some of the themes that have emerged and to think about how the Centre might take some of those things forward. And as I say, one of the themes that has resonated very strongly with me is the way in which migration is a recurrent theme in the context of conflicts of various kinds. And the other very recurrent theme is how, as Sabir said, isolation is no longer an option. That if we wanted to sort of hide behind the idea of being disconnected from others and not responsible for what's going on in places out there, the changes that have taken place globally over the last 20 years in particular have really made that very difficult to maintain as a sort of positional way of looking at the world. Now that comes partly because of this phenomenon which Sabir described as the world getting smaller, and as academics we call time-space compression, which essentially is the idea that not only has it become easier for some, but certainly not all, to move over time and space because of changes in global transportation and connections between places in terms of social media and other means, but because we are more connected as human beings. Over time, we have developed relationships with places that we didn't previously have, often because of diaspora communities, because there have been waves of migration moving into places over time. And we see that very much in a city like Coventry, which has historically had waves of migration of various kinds coming into the city and led to a sort of a diversity, a kind of complexity of the population that didn't exist previously. The other theme that I think has come up, and it was raised earlier by the gentleman over here, was about the connectivity between issues. That you cannot think about peace or indeed conflict or the relationship between them without thinking about the things that lead there not to be peace or that undermine the possibility for that peace, including, of course, the ongoing conflicts in various places that don't come from nowhere. They come from historical contexts, and they are informed by and fed by certain interests and objectives of different groups. And you can't look at any conflict right now without seeing that. And when we look at what's going on in the European context, which I'll come on to in a moment, we have to think very hard about the backdrop to that current scenario, which is the conflict particularly in Syria since 2011, but of course that conflict in Syria didn't come from nowhere either, and in all of these places there is an interest a collection of interests supported by and informed by commercial interests, by the arms trade, etc., that ultimately enables that to happen. And so, you know, one of the things that was on social media last week was there are 30,000 people coming to London. They're not refugees, they're coming to the arms trade show. So there is a kind of contradiction in how we want there to be peace and yet we engage in activities of the kinds that have been described, which actually potentially and do undermine that peace for others. So there's a connection between people and places and a connection between issues. And it is, I have to say, in that context, very easy sometimes to become quite negative about what is going on in the world, because it can feel very big and very difficult to do anything about. And I suppose one of the things that's really important in terms of this idea about partnerships for peace, and in terms of the work that I guess many of us are engaged in, is how one of the things for me that is critical about the idea of peace is not simply the absence of conflict, but the prospect of hope, the idea that there can be something different. And that idea of hope, I think, is what underpins certainly a lot of the refugees that I work with, the idea that there might be something beyond what they are currently having to experience, and it's that kind of keeps them going, looking for something else, and sometimes somewhere else where they might build that peace for themselves and their families. And I think this idea of hope is really important because it isn't often talked about in any kind of meaningful way, in the same way as the issue of compassion isn't often talked about in any meaningful way. So I spent Saturday afternoon sitting in the O2 listening to the Dalai Lama talking about compassion and about the importance of compassion in the context of conflict within his own community, of course, with the Tibetan community with whom I work, but also more broadly in the context of many different conflicts that we see. And although there's a little bit of a respite from the cynicism right now, in general terms, compassion is viewed as something of a dirty word, as something that we shouldn't necessarily hold on to. And in fact, there was an article just 2 days ago in the Daily Mail, my favourite paper, which claimed that there was too much compassion towards what's going on in Europe, that compassion was wrongly directed towards groups of people who might want to cause us harm. So even in a situation like now, we can be accused of being too compassionate, of being too hopeful, of being too optimistic, of having our sort of solidarity undermined. But I think that hope and compassion is what kind of keeps us going. It's what informs and underpins our partnerships. It's that idea that there might be a possibility of something different. So I'd really like to emphasise that and take on board very much Saveer's point that actually that compassion and that hope that we share for others actually is a really important and critical part of our own happiness, which of course is very much the message that I took from the Dalai Lama on Saturday in his teachings, is very much about the way in which our selflessness or our attempts to help others be in a position where they have opportunity and peace actually brings to us some sort of inner peace and happiness too, often in a context where people struggle to find that. Because ironically, as has already been said, peace isn't recognised when you're in it, it's only recognised when you're away from it somehow. So that theme of relationships between places, between ideas and between people, for me, is a really important one, which I guess brings us to this idea of partnership. And for us, certainly within the centre, and I know many people in this room also, partnerships are a really important way of going about peace because they're about the process and not just the outcome. It's what you achieve through the process of partnership working that takes you sometimes to places which you might not have predicted or anticipated at the outset, but which takes you to a place with somebody or with an organisation where you can feel mutually that you've come to the place where you want to be. And that's not to say that that place ever stops or is fixed, but you have a shared understanding of what it is that you're trying to achieve. And I think that's very much something that is part of Cord's work, in terms of it not simply being an imposed peace or an agreement, but rather something that is agreed through consensus and through understanding what it is that other people want out of that process. So I suppose, and this is where I have to sort of put my centre hat on and speak for the centre and the kind of work that we do, because that's what I was asked to do. I suppose for us, it's really in the centre, as I said earlier, about working with other organisations at the local, the national and the international level to try and create opportunities for building partnerships that might lead us to that place, without necessarily knowing at the outset what that place might be. And I just wanted really to give you 3 examples of that work, just really to encourage engagement if it's something that you're interested in, or critique if it's something that you think we're doing not as well as we might. The first is really around the local level. It's bringing home to bear what's currently going on in the European context. So as I said earlier, my work is very much in relation to international migration in general, and at the moment I'm about to embark upon a piece of research which we've secured funding for, to talk to people who've crossed the Mediterranean over the last 3 or 4 months about their journeys, about the things that led them to make those journeys, about the reasons why they ended up where they ended up. So I'm heading to Sicily tomorrow, and I've got colleagues in Malta and Turkey talking to people who are about to embark on journeys across dangerous, if short, areas of water. But the importance of all of that is it's not just out there, it's not just something that's happening in that environment, it's something that resonates very strongly with what's being experienced here in Coventry. And so we held an event Sabir and I, earlier, like last week, talking about the Mediterranean refugee crisis and talking about some of the factors that are underpinning that crisis. And those factors, as I say, are nothing new. And for those of us that work in international migration are incredibly predictable, I'm afraid. But they're also about how we respond to that, how we build our partnerships in Coventry to create the capacity to do something. Because I know there's a huge will to do something right now, but it's not always straightforward as to how you do that. So for those of you who don't know, Coventry is one of very few cities in the UK that have already taken Syrian refugees through resettlement programmes. Not very many, no criticism of Coventry, it's a criticism of the government policy, but around 40% of all the Syrians who've come to the UK so far through the Syrian resettlement programme have come to Coventry. And they've come to Coventry because of this long history of peace and reconciliation, and because the City Council has been willing to stand up for what it believes to be right in terms of responding to this particular crisis. So the question for us is, how do we extend that welcome, and how do we give other local authorities the knowledge and the evidence they need to feel that they can do this, they can take this step, even though their local population might be anxious or have attitudes that are not particularly welcoming towards people coming into their communities, which we know to be the case. So at the local level for us, that's really important. I know that there's work that my colleagues have been involved with at the Cathedral, particularly around the role of faith in conflict prevention, working with the Cathedral, with Lambeth Palace, and with the Anglican Alliance, and that was again an ESRC funded piece of work, looking at how faith-based approaches can be developed in certain locations, and what might be the benefits as well as the problems of doing that, where people from different faiths come together. And that work has been taking place in Nigeria and the Solomon Islands, and with partners from across a range of different faith organisations. So again, it's about what can we take to different environments and learn from different environments and build partnerships in those places. And the third thing that I wanted to draw your attention to, because I should, and there are leaflets for it at the back of the room, is the Rising Festival, which is effectively Coventry's answer to Demos, the Global Forum for Peace, with Desmond Tutu is Archbishop Desmond Tutu is the patron, and it's coming to Coventry this November. So for us again, this is about building international partnerships where Coventry can bring to bear its experience of working in this area, but also learn from the experience in a wide range of other environments about what works, what doesn't work in terms of building partnerships for peace. And the theme for me is a really important one this year. It's a hard road to hope. And again, it comes back to this idea of hope. But actually some of the most intractable crises that we see around us today, they are not as intractable perhaps as they might seem, because historically there has often been and has always been these kinds of crises. And what's really important about when you look at these things historically is that none of those crises were ever solved through violence. Every single conflict ultimately, for any kind of durable and sustainable peace, required dialogue. And that's just not talk, and it's not the imposition of the views of others. It's real partnership and real meaningful dialogue between the different parties involved. So the objective of the event, the series of events that are taking place as part of Rising, is to try and get that really meaningful dialogue taking place, not just at the local level, but also internationally. And I have to say, I haven't been in Coventry very long. I've been at the centre for just coming up to a year, and I moved to Coventry on Monday. So I feel still that it's a very new city for me in terms of getting to know everything that's going on. But I know every city has its issues. I'm not for 1 minute, coming in thinking that it would be otherwise. But I've been really impressed so far by everything that's happening in this city in terms of the real dialogue and the real partnership that happens between people. And I hope that the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations can be a big part of that too. So thank you.